Next up on the agenda, we have Emily Edgeley, who's going to be speaking about storytelling, or specifically how to tell better stories more often to boost your security outcomes. Emily is a public speaking coach, and I think for those who have attended a SIT summit in years past, or even a SANS Security Awareness Summit, there's been a lot of talk around storytelling because stories are an incredibly powerful tool. Because if you give me a list of information before you're halfway through, I would have already forgotten the first points on the list. However, if you tell me a good story, not only will I remember it, I'll be more likely to share it. So I think we've spoken about the power of storytelling, but really I think Emily as a public speaking coach is going to be really fascinating to hear how we can bring that to life. So Emily, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Awesome. So I want to start by asking you guys to cast your mind back to the last time that you were sitting in either a meeting, a conversation, or a presentation where you just did not quite get what the person was on about. Maybe they dove straight into the detail, or maybe they gave you so many discrete bits of information that you just couldn't remember it all. Now, I want you to think about the impact of that. Security is a very complicated industry, right? And the time's ticking. We've got to always try and catch up with the bad guys. So we can't afford for our stakeholders to walk away from conversations with us thinking, not quite sure what that person was on about, or I'm not really clear what I meant to do with that information, or misunderstanding what's required and going off on a totally different tangent. So I want to share with you the amazing superpower that storytelling is. And if you can learn how to use it in your environment as much as possible, you're going to increase not only the outcomes that you get, but the outcomes that your company gets as a result. Now, if you're thinking at this moment, oh God, I'm not a natural storyteller, like this is not really going to be for me, I want to sort of let you feel a little bit more confident, because I was definitely that person. I did a pure maths undergraduate. Yes, I don't know really why now if I look back, but I did 3 years of a pure mathematics degree, and then I did a 2-year Masters of Information Security. So if that gives you any indication, the indication is that I love numbers and things that are black and white. And whenever I would present, it would be very factual. I didn't even know about what storytelling was until one fateful day, and I can really remember this clearly. I was sitting at my desk at work at 55 Collins Street in Melbourne on level 36 with an amazing view, watching a TED talk by Simon Sinek. And if any of you have watched it, you'll know it's about the power of starting with why. And if you haven't watched it, I would really recommend that you do after this. But anyway, his talk went for about 18 minutes. And I remember I was glued to my screen for those 18 minutes. I was so fascinated by what he was talking about. It literally blew my mind. And I remember as soon as the talk finished, I went to Google, I found a copy of his Golden Circle, and I printed it out and I stuck it on my laptop. And from sort of that moment forward, when I would email someone, I would think about, how can I start with why before going into the detail? When I would have a conversation with someone, I would start with the why. When I was running a meeting, I would start with the why. Even it changed my thinking style. When I was thinking about problems, I was like, why are we tackling this problem before I go into how I'm going to tackle it? So it's safe to say he completely got me to change my behavior. And I remember when I was taking the train home that evening and later that night, I was thinking about it and I was thinking, how did he do it? Literally, I wanted to figure out what was the secret that got me so moved in such a short frame of time when I had spent 5 years at university and learnt a cripe load, I'll try not to swear, and it had never moved me at all. So I started to do a little bit of investigating. And the more I looked into this, the more I realized all paths were sort of leading towards storytelling. And so I thought, okay, great. the key to being able to replicate what that guy just did, Simon Sinek, is to learn the art of storytelling. And so I threw myself into this little journey of my own, trying to learn the art of storytelling. I watched more TED Talks. I did a Toastmasters advanced storytelling course. I did a Pixar storytelling course. I told stories, I wrote stories, I did everything. And that then got me thinking about another question, because I could tell the power of stories, and I knew they had a place in Hollywood. I knew they had a place in books, but I was still trying to figure out, where does storytelling fit into the security and the tech world? I wasn't seeing any storytelling really in the security and tech world. And I wanted to figure out, is there a place? And if so, where is that place? And that's essentially what this talk is all about. I want to share with you how I have made sense of storytelling and how I see it fitting into the security world. Now, before I jump into some of the how, I really want to spend some time talking about the power of storytelling. Now, you may already be convinced about the power of storytelling, but I know on my journey, the more I found out about the power of storytelling, the more I was convinced I was going to use it. So I know that will be the same for you here. Okay, so let's think about when you're communicating. Whether it's running a meeting or a very formal presentation to a board, you really have, in my mind, 3 outcomes you're trying to hit. First and foremost, people need to be able to understand what you're saying, right? I know it sounds super fundamental, but people need to be able to understand the points that you're making clearly and how it relates to them. People are always thinking, you probably heard of the acronym WIFM, what's in it for me? People are always doing that translation live when you're talking to them. So the first bit is that relatability understanding. Secondly, people need to remember what you have said. You know, it needs to stick in their minds after you've left the room, because we don't walk around with our notepads everywhere. We don't have photographic memories. So it needs to be said in a way that people can retain that and then use that later, whether they make a decision based off it, whether they share it with someone else. Thirdly, in a lot of cases, we want to influence behavior change, right? Maybe you're wanting people to buy into a process rather than thinking it's a tick in the box. Maybe you need approval for a security initiative. Maybe there's some behaviors that aren't conducive to the right security outcomes and you need to change the thinking. So you also want to be able to influence behavior change. So think about relatability, there's a retention element, and then there's an influential element. Now, stories will win hands down in all of those cases. And I want to bring that to life for you with a couple of stories. So if we think about the relatability aspect and the retention aspect, I want you to think about how many presentations you have seen in your whole career to date. I know myself, and whenever I ask this in workshops, generally the answer is about between 100 to 1,000. Okay, so if we think there's that sort of statistic, then of those presentations, how many have you remembered in enough detail that you could recount them to someone else days, weeks, even years later? I know from experience, that the answer is generally in the ballpark of around a couple. So if you think we've heard hundreds or thousands and we can relay a couple, that's pretty dismal. Now, I remember a specific scenario when I was the committee member for our ANZ Toastmasters. So we used to get executives that would come in and present to our club. We thought it would be a bit interesting to get, real life people that are quite good presenters to talk about what they've learned along the way. Now, most people, when they came to present to our club, told us a heap of different information. And that was great. And we would dutifully be scribbling these notes down on a piece of pad and paper. But after the session was finished, because there was so many discrete bits of information, we couldn't really use that information very easily, except for one guy. And I still remember this about 7 years after the fact. He told us a tip and he wrapped it around a story, and it went something like this. He said to us, so I was a researcher. I did research at university. And out of university, the first job I got was in the mines. And we all got brought in at this multidisciplinary project. And they sat us down and they said to us, your job is to reduce the number of deaths that are happening in the mine. So people were dying. They wanted to figure out how people were dying and reduce that number. Now, he said that the project went on for a year or two, but they achieved their goal. And it was, it was hard working in a multidisciplinary team. It was hard to figure it out, but it was easy because they knew what they were trying to achieve and they were given the flexibility to work out how. And he said that experience in that particular company in the mines made such an impact on him that it changed the way that he led teams up until the time he was speaking to us. And he said, when he leads his teams, he spends a long time getting very clear on what's the initiative trying to solve, what's the end goal, what's that outcome, what does success look like? Not so much about how you're going to get there, but get clear on what that is. And he said this really played to his benefit when he had to get funding for a very, very large initiative. He went up to the CEO and he explained exactly what they were there to do. And he was honest, he said, I don't know exactly how we're going to get there, but that's what we're aiming for. And he said that he was then given this extraordinary amount of funding to go ahead with this initiative. And so he concluded by saying to us, you need to be clear on what you're aiming for. When you're leading people, don't tell them how, just tell them what you're aiming for and they will figure it out. That's the clarity that they need. Now, had he just said to us, like all the other executives at those Toastmaster sessions, you need to be clear about the end outcome when you're leading people, we wouldn't have been able to relate to that as much. And we also I would not be here recounting his presentation 7 years later. So if you want a message to stick in people's minds, you definitely need to tell a story. Now, I talked about 3 elements. So the influential element, stories also win hands down if you're wanting to influence behavior change. And let me bring to life a different story for you. So this one, I want you to cast your mind back in time. The year is 1987. The setting is in Texas, and there's an 18-month-old girl called Jessica playing around, a bonny toddler playing around with her aunt in their back garden. It's a sunny afternoon and they're playing around with some toys. Now the phone rings and the aunt hears the phone ring from outside, runs back inside, picks up the phone and starts chatting away. Now, as she's doing this, the 18-month-old baby Jessica is sort of toddling around with her toys and she wanders over to this well, which is in the back garden. And it's not concealed well, pardon the pun. Now, the well is about 30 centimeters wide, so it's pretty narrow, and it's 2 stories deep. Now, no surprise here, what actually happens next. She's peeking into this well and she falls in. She falls down, 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 down with a thump. She cries. She's all squished. And she's crying and no one can hear her. And of course, you can imagine she's terrified with what on earth just happened. The aunt finishes up on the telephone, comes out, can't see baby Jessica, but can hear some whimpering, rushes to the well, looks down and sees baby Jessica down there. She shrieks and runs back in to figure out what on earth to do. She calls the ambulance, she speaks to the police. Within a few minutes, they're on the scene. They then have to figure out, oh my God, how on earth are we going to get this poor child out? They go through their options. We can't throw a rope down because she's injured and she's too small to be able to pull herself out. We can't go into the hole because it's too narrow. An adult won't fit in that hole. So they realize the only thing that they're going to be able to do is drill a hole down and drill a hole across large enough for an adult to fit in and get this poor child out. Now, not long after, and this is a true story, by the way, not long after the ambulance, fire brigade, etc. arrive, then CNN arrive on the scene and they start broadcasting this all around the United States. Now, they think that it's going to take them 8 hours, but this drags on and on and on because the machinery that they're using is to bore holes into the ground for oil. It's not to bore sideways. And so when they get to the point of going sideways, it really slows down. Poor baby Jessica is still stuck in that well, and they're singing Winnie the Pooh songs to her to try and keep her spirits up. Now, 4 hours turns into 58 hours. And you can imagine, even if that was you, how terrifying that would be for 58 hours. So they get this poor child out and she is alive. Now, she's bruised, she's battered, she's got a broken limb, but she's okay. Now, the people in America, and maybe some of you tuning in might be from the United States and you actually remember this, were so moved by what they had been watching over these few days that they decided to donate to a trust fund for baby Jessica. And they donated in the order of about $500,000. And if you can think about it, back in 1987, that's an extraordinary amount of money then, let alone what that would be now. So I want you to think hard about that. For one child, people donated $500,000. Now, if I take some information, something about other children in different areas of the world, in Africa, in the Middle East, who are in potentially worse instances or scenarios day to day, if we replay those statistics to people, would they donate $500,000 per child? Now, I'm sure you're all shaking your head and thinking, no, that's not the case. And the reason is people are not motivated to act based on facts and figures. They're motivated to act based on a story. And that's because stories are more relatable. Stories have more impact. We'll be thinking when we're watching that, oh my goodness, imagine that was my child or my next door neighbor's child or my niece or my nephew, or imagine that was me. How scary that would be. That's what people are thinking, and that's what motivates people to act. It's that relatability aspect. So if you want to get people to relate to what you're saying, to remember what you're saying, and to act based on what you're saying, then find a way to share a story. Now, I want to explain to you how I have come up with a way to apply that and make that easy, because you don't want to have to go with the Hollywood version of the story all the time. So I want to take you through 2 different approaches to telling stories. And let me just move my slides along. Okay. So there's really, in my mind, 3 key ingredients that you need for a very simple story. Now, remember, it's not Steven Spielberg. We don't need it to be a Hollywood version all the time. If you think more like Jamie Oliver and his like simple meals, a 3-ingredient story is a very basic version, but it's still much more powerful than information alone. So let me take you through the elements. Every story needs characters in it. It might sound really obvious, but if you don't have humans in the mix, you don't have a story. A simple story will have a structure of 3. And in fact, even a complicated story will have a structure of 3. So there's 3 parts to the structure of a story. And I will go through these in a little bit more detail. You also need to have some action in your story. Now, yes, you can have dialogue in a story. Yes, you can have a heap of descriptive language about what people heard, smelt, felt, etc. You can have the emotions of the characters, etc. You can have conflict. You don't actually always need those elements. So I want to make storytelling a little bit more achievable and easy. So trust me, you can have a story with just these 3 elements. Let me bring it to life for you a little bit more. So if you think about the most fundamental difference between information and a story, there's that it has characters in it. And of course, whenever we hear anything, if you think about if anyone presents to you on a process, a framework, a story, a strategy as an example, you're always thinking, what's in it for me, or what's in it for our customers here? It's always about the translation from the thing to people. So if you bring people into the mix, you're giving someone that translation and not making them have to do it themselves. Now, people are obviously a key sort of character in a story. You have to have at least one. Another rule of thumb is definitely don't have more than 4 humans in your story. It gets way too complicated if you're like, oh, there's Isabel and Peter and Arabella and Alice and Emily, and then you switch between them. So ideally, I try and stick to like 1 or 2, but if you want, no more than 4. The other thing to talk about in terms of characters is, if you think about it, a strategy or a tool is actually a character. That's essentially the hero of your story. So it doesn't always have to be people. Let's go on to the structure. Now, I like to think about, in my mind, I almost have like 3 containers for the 3 parts of a structure. It's the before, during, or the after, or the beginning, middle, and an end. Now, there's a reason for my river there that you can see. I like to think of a story as taking people from one side of a river to the other side. It's almost like this is the side that they don't want to be on, where there's issues and problems and frustration, and they want to get to the other side where life's better, it's easier, it's simpler, it's safer, whatever. So if you think about that analogy, what do people care most about in that analogy? They care most about getting from one side of the river to the other. So in fact, the vehicle that gets them there isn't the most important thing. The most important thing to them is the fact that they don't want to be where they are now and they want to get to the other side. It's also a little bit like, if you think about it, and I'm just going to check where I am for time, it's also a bit like if you've ever bought a gym membership or something like that, the biggest factor was not what type of workouts that will give you, etc. It's more that that's going to make you feel lighter, that's going to make you have more energy, that's going to make you feel better about yourself. It's the before and after that people care about most. That's what I want you to take away from this. There's obviously also an element of time in a story. So it could be minutes your story could go for, or it could be hours or days, but there's obviously always an element of time in that structure. The other element that I talked about is action. And what I mean by that is, I've seen people try and write stories where it's statements. So it might be something like this: people are unhappy with the situation at the moment. That's not a story. It's got characters in it, but you want the characters to be doing something. So you want to be explaining what the impact of that is, like maybe not this extreme, but what is that causing people to do now? Maybe they're giving their passwords out. Maybe they're opening themselves up to ransomware. Maybe they're letting people follow them in behind them in the door. Whatever it is, talk about the action. Now, there's 2 ways in my mind that you can use stories moving forward. And I like to think of it as these sort of 2 analogies. You can either turn information into a story or find a story to make a point. And I want to explain those 2 like this. It's sort of like turning information into a story is a little bit like where you look at your fridge and you're like, okay, there's not much in my fridge, but I've got mushrooms. So I could turn those mushrooms into a risotto. Now, the other option is where you find a story to make a point. It's a little bit like when you decide exactly what you want to cook. You don't have the ingredients, but you go out and get them. Maybe you think, oh, I want to make a salmon taco. So you go out and get them. There's those 2 ways in my mind that you can use stories. So the first option is great for when people are asking you to present on something. Maybe it's an incident. Maybe it's a strategy. Maybe it's a tool. Maybe it's a process. Really simple way that you might not think is storytelling is actually to turn that into a narrative. And what I mean by that is the strategy, tool, process, incident becomes the middle. You then pad it out with some context of the before and after, or the start and the ending, to explain where that's taking people from. Remember the analogy of the river? Where are they now and where do they want to be? What's the context of the incident and where do you hope people move to in the future with obviously different controls in place? So that's a really, really simple way. And you can use that for anything that you're talking about. It could be an initiative, etc. As long as you bring characters in, the structure, and some action. Another option, which you should also come up to a lot, is where you want to make a point. Now, what I mean by that is it could be something like you want to get everyone to believe that risk is everyone's responsibility, or you want to try and get everyone to buy into the need for two-factor authentication, or to not reuse passwords, or to have secure passwords. Literally, whatever it is, it can be security related, or it can be more like leadership related. If you have a clear point you're trying to make, you can easily find a story that proves that point, that has a start, a middle, and an ending. And I will explain to you now how I almost never have a time when I think I can't find a story. So just checking the time. Okay, good. So there's really 4 story sources in my mind. So let's just take a point that you're trying to make. Maybe you're trying to make the point around the need for a secure password, a strong password. First option that I would always get you to go to is your own experience. So let's just say you believe in that as a point. You believe that people should have long passwords. Now, you must have had some experience that has prompted that for you. I did a poll on this recently about what is the biggest factor that's motivated you to learn something in your life. And 99% of people said it's an experience rather than being told something. Now, apart from making someone experience something, which is hard in a presentation, the next best thing is to tell a story, because it's an experience that you're sharing with someone. So have you experienced either where you haven't had a secure password and what it meant for you, or you've been in a company where people didn't have secure passwords and the impact? So in a lot of cases, you will have your own experience to refer to. Perhaps you have had a colleague, maybe when you've been to a security conference, maybe your boss has told you, maybe you've heard on, I don't know, not a podcast because that's another option, but someone's told you something directly. You could use that as an option to then retell that. The third option is more the podcast one that I just mentioned before. There's so much information out there in the public domain now. So you can go either online, maybe it's a podcast, maybe it's social media, maybe it's a newsletter, maybe it's an article, maybe it's on Google even. There is so much information out there that goes into detail about particular stories. The last option is, it doesn't sound that good, but it's actually the 2 at the ends are probably the best, your own and a made up. The made up story is more like a hypothetical story where you would bring to life something for someone and make the audience the central characters in a lot of cases. And you say to them, I want you to imagine, and then you bring that story to life. Now, I will give you a very quick example, if I have 1 minute, of a made up story and how that relates to the security world. So I remember I had a client, and this is very representative of what I see a lot happening, where they wanted to present on open banking. They were talking to a large conference at their organization, and they wanted to talk about what open banking was. Now, their approach was going to be give the industry definition from the government about what open banking is, give some timelines about what's happening within the organization for this, and then go into detail about the functionality, etc. And I said to this person, let's try a story. So in there, she brought to life this particular person. She called it John. And she said, this is what John's doing now when he's trying to compare banking products. And this is how hard it is for him to compare banking products. And she sort of brought that a bit to life. And then she said, okay, once we introduce open banking, this is how John will be able to compare banking products. This is how easy it will be to be. So in the first instance, he couldn't really do it. And in the second instance, it's super clear. It's got all the different competition, and then he can go and decide what's best for him. Now, what was very clear when she did that in that auditorium was how simple the impact of open banking was going to be. And what it meant was that people could then leave that conversation and go and have conversations with other people about open banking in a way that really resonated. And then they could pass the message on. So what I want to leave you with is this question. If you're wanting to either share information, so that strategy, tool, or process or incident, find a way to pad it out into a narrative and add characters, add the timeline and structure, and add some action. Or if you're trying to make a point, find a story that will suit. I can guarantee that you will stay in the hearts and minds of the audience long after you've left the room or left the Zoom call. Awesome. Over to you guys.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Emily. If anyone has any last minute questions to answer, I can see one coming through in Slack that may or may not make the cut. I see our next speaker standing in the wings. So while we do have a couple of minutes though, one quick question from me is, obviously storytelling is incredibly important with what we do, and we've kind of utilized that wherever we can, but interested to hear, do you have any thoughts or views around what mediums maybe also lend themselves better to stories, or maybe perhaps the types of stories? So obviously video, written, verbal, are there kinds of stories that we should kind of, that lend themselves better to different medium?
Not really. I think if you're wanting to build, it's more about the outcome, I would say, rather than the medium. So if you're wanting to build trust around, say, yourself and build some sort of a connection with yourself, so maybe it's more in a leadership capacity, then you would want to share personal stories. But in the security world, it's more about the message and the outcome. So it's about finding the right story to make that point for those characters. So I would think more about it in terms of who I'm presenting to and what's going to resonate with them, and then find a story that's going to suit, because you'll be able to find a heap of different stories to satisfy one point. And it's about making sure that, like, does other characters in the story that you're going to share, will they resonate most with that particular audience? And does that show the best before and after, really? So I don't really think it matters so much in terms of whether you're writing it or not, but perhaps when you're writing it, it needs to be even simpler, because, you know, if you're sending an email to someone, they don't want to receive an essay. Whereas if it's in a video, it can probably be a little bit longer because that's a little bit more entertaining.
Yeah. Another quick question is, I guess storytelling is a really powerful tool for cyber influence or awareness teams, but also equally, we're not the only ones within the security organization engaging with the business. So it's not just about us telling great stories, but I think, are there any tips that you could give the people on the call around how they can maybe instill that mentality of starting with the why with security teams, so they can be more impactful in their engagements? Because I think sometimes the why tends to be because I said so, or because it's the right thing to do. But I think it's not. It doesn't necessarily then lend itself to others who may not be security professionals.
Yeah, so I mean, this is a perfect example of the second scenario I was talking about, where if you want to make a point, find a story that will suit. So if you're wanting to make a point that you need to start with the why, like that's what you're wanting to influence the behavior change, then if that was me, I always go to, do I believe that? If I believe that, what's the most recent experience where that's been really brought to life for me? And it can either be where someone didn't start with the power of why and the impact that that had on you, or if someone did start with why and the impact that that had on you. That's going to resonate so much more with people than just telling them you need to start with why, or giving them the sort of logical reasoning for it. If you don't think on the, and that shouldn't take a lot of time to think of that particular scenario. You can almost do that off the cuff. If you don't have that example, I always then go to Google and try and find are there any incredible stories about the power of why that I can share? If not, then use a hypothetical example. And I feel like in my presentation just then, I'm pretty sure I used one of all those 4 types of stories: my own, someone else that told me, a famous one, and a hypothetical one. So you can always find an option.
We've got one last question from Carl before we jump to the next speaker. Is a lot of the technical people in the IT or cybersecurity space don't necessarily like the fluffy stuff that awareness or our community, how it's viewed.
Yeah.
How would you suggest telling the story to those technical folks that can help catch their attention?
Yes. So it's actually a really important question. And it's someone asked me this on social media recently. If you're going to say to people, I want to share a story with you, then their reaction is probably going to be either like an eye roll or oh, no, we don't have time for that. So what I've learned is it's actually better not to say that. And in a lot of cases, you don't need to. So if you're trying to make a point and there's a reason why you're sharing a story, like you're obviously not sharing it for story's sake, then I would just transition organically to what your experience is or the example you're wanting to illustrate. So you can say, you need to have strong passwords. And I really do believe this. Let me explain to you an incident that happened to me a couple of months ago that really brought this to life. Or you might be able to say, why is this so important to have strong passwords? I want you to imagine for a moment. So you don't actually need to use the word stories. And I would say that's the bit that gets people offside. And my stories are not fluffy. It's not a like, once upon a time, people were, dancing through the fields and da-da-da-da. To me, a story is not about the descriptive language and all of that. The power of a story is connecting the dots for people, humanizing things, and helping humans relate to it.
Brilliant. Emily, thank you very much. That was fascinating. I know there's a bunch of comments that have come through in the Slack of people who have very much appreciated your insights. So I'll let you jump off and jump into that and answer any questions that may come through. And I'll just move my camera over here and intro the next speaker. Thanks again, Emily.
Thank you.